Hello and welcome. My name is Brooke Shaden. I'm a fine art photographer, and I want to take you through a really fun thing, for me at least, that I hope will be fun for you, which is to talk about the Storied Brand. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that means. First, I want to say thank you so much to Sony for hosting Kando everywhere, for having me speak here. I'm so excited. I can't wait to answer your questions, and I can't wait to dive deeper into this topic that is one of my favorite things in the whole world. So a lot of people don't know this about me, but I am obsessed with branding, and I'm obsessed with it because I'm obsessed with story. Story is my love. It's my everything. It's like I live and I breathe story. I see stories everywhere in the tiniest little things and even in the biggest. And if I could just talk about story as it relates to you and me all day long, I would. And that's what we're going to talk about, is the storied brand. How do you create a story that is wrapped up all around you and your interests and your passions? And how do you get people excited about that thing that you love so much, which is your storied brand? So let's dive into talking about that, exactly what it is, and specifically how can you transform your business into a story that people want to hear? How can you talk about something that is personal to you in a way that also relates to other people? I'm just so excited. I love this. I love this topic. So I can't wait to just dive right in. And before I do that, I want to show you a couple of pictures that are me, that are so exactly who I am as an individual, as a person. It's just this image totally represents who I am and what I do. I actually shot this on a Sony photo walk in November 2019, and I jumped into a river in Portland. It might have been the Portland River, I don't even know. And it was early in the morning, it was foggy, I had a bunch of people with me and they were all looking at me like I was crazy, and jumped in the water and did this portrait. And I am never happier than when I am doing something weird and crazy and uncomfortable. That is when you will find me at my best, that I think is my best, my happiest, my most joyful, my most connected, my most purposeful. And that's what I love so much about creating, is that it connects you to your purpose. It connects you to your value and your worth and your passion and your excitement. And so these are just some examples behind the scenes shooting images of where I felt so truly connected to what I was doing. And the reason why I bother telling you this is because it's those moments of extreme connection that you might call creative flow, where we truly are able to explore who we are and why we create and why that's important. And it's those moments that should guide us into doing what we do for a living and how we spend our lives. So that image that you just saw, this one right here, led to this image. As you can see, my art and who I am as a person are very different. One is dark, one is light, one is joyful, one is sad. And that doesn't mean that they're different or that one does not represent who I am, but they are two different parts of my brand. So if you believe that you are separate from your business or your brand or your art, then you're not paying close enough attention. You need to really settle into this fact that who you are breeds your art and your business. You cannot make art that is not tied to you. It's not possible. Your art doesn't have to be autobiographical, but your art is still intrinsically tied to who you are and what lies within. And the same goes for your business. So let's just take that step in that direction right now to acknowledge that who you are and what you do is all tied together, and we need to acknowledge that to run a successful business. So the storied brand is a central story that will push all of your offerings forward. So you have a story that goes along with who you are and what you do, right? And everything that you put out there should further that story. Now, it doesn't have to be a single story. It could be a few different stories, but being aware of those stories is what will help you sort of create or cultivate an audience that is aligned with what you do and what you want to offer. The storied brand is content that tells the story of your values and your opinions and your way of thinking. And if we can acknowledge those things, your values, your opinions, your way of thinking, then you're going to create a more specific brand. And a lot of people have said to me, but I don't want to create a specific brand. I want to create a broad band. No pun intended. And, really create something that touches lots of people. But the fact is that you can do that and you still will most likely be unsuccessful in touching a lot of people in a meaningful way. The best thing that we can do as artists especially is to recognize that our brand is not for everybody. It's for a specific group of people, and we need to connect to those people the most. So that's what I want to focus on in my Storied brand. Now let's look at really popular companies that have associations with a story. The first one is Apple. Their story is about innovation. It always has been. It's been about, if you buy this computer, you'll be more creative, more innovative, more successful in your art. And that's why so many artists buy Macs, because the story that they're selling is innovation. Yes, they're selling a computer, but really they're selling the story. Coca-Cola always relates their ads back to family. If you can think even through the years, the 100+ years that they've had their company, it's always about creating this feeling of togetherness and home and like really nice, warm, fuzzy feelings. And then if we relate this to artists, if you think of Van Gogh, he's this tortured soul, and knowing that enhances his art. Ansel Adams has this sort of, his work is wrapped up in this idea of expansive America, and what does that mean? And those are the stories that are being told that are associated with brands and products and offerings and art. And it's important that we recognize that some of the most successful companies in the world are not selling a product, they are selling a story. So, would you associate those stories with those brands if the narrative wasn't tied directly to the product? No. They make an effort to make sure that their product is directly tied to their story, and because of that, the entire offering is elevated. And I want you to know something, that just because I'm bringing up companies like Apple and Coca-Cola doesn't mean that I'm saying this in a negative way, because often we think about big companies and we think, oh, sellout, or oh, they're just a corporate machine and stuff like that. That's not my point. My point is that truly their offering is elevated because of their story. When you use an Apple computer, let's say, maybe you feel more innovative because that story has been ingrained in you. Now, I'm a Microsoft user and I fully believe the same goes for Microsoft. That is an aside. But nonetheless, these are brands that have stories, and the story reaches inside of you and it touches something that you need to hear, and therefore you buy that product. Same goes for art. Same. So when you look at these images again, you see the me of my personality, happy and bright and bubbly, and you see the me of my art, which is deep and sad and digging and searching and, dark. And you think, how could these two things possibly go together? She's happy and her art is not. She's joyful and energetic and her art is sad and, lonely. And let me share exactly how these things go together. I have two stories within my brand. One of them is infectious, accessible creativity. The other is finding beauty in darkness. One is expressed through my personality. The other one is expressed through my art. And you can have multiple stories within your brand, and that is okay. And that doesn't take away from what you're trying to do. So, for example, when I started art, making images 10 years ago, people would say to me, you're so different from your art. How, basically what they were saying was, do you meet the expectations of people when they meet you? And my answer was, what I'm doing is I'm giving permission for people to be however they need to be and create the art that they need to create, even if those two things are not seemingly in alignment. And I have always made that part of my business, my brand, and who I am. So we need to get clear on the stories that you want to tell, how those narratives impact other people as well, because I know my story. My story is that I am joyful about creating, and I create in innovative ways. My art, however, is very different. I'm going to make sure that I understand how those two things impact people so that I can create the best work possible. How then do you find your narrative? How do you find that story that will be the central thing that dictates everything else that you do? It seems really daunting, right? Well, the first thing is to recognize that it can change. Your story can absolutely change, and that's okay. This is a long life we're living, I think. That's my opinion. Everyone always says life is so short. Nah, I think that life is actually pretty generous. And it gives us most often the opportunity to reinvent ourselves, if only you would take it. So don't feel trapped by whatever narrative or story you feel called to say today, because it could be different later, and that's totally fine. There are ways, though, that we find that narrative and that story and that essentially that legacy, and it's through 4 stages. And these 4 stages are really important. They're honesty, shame, grief, and trust. And I want to tell you exactly why I believe these are the 4 pillars of our narrative, okay? So honesty is really, it has to be the first one, because if you're honest about your true interests and passions and ideologies, then you can set the foundation for your story. But if you're not honest with yourself about exactly what those ideologies are and those passions and interests, then you'll never be able to get past that first stage to find that true narrative and legacy that you're trying to put out there in the world. So then how do we outline that for ourselves? Well, we ask these questions. So the first question is, what are your passions? What are your interests? It's very simple and yet not so simple at all. You might have a list a mile long of all the things that you love, or you might have nothing on that list because you just don't know, because you've never honestly answered that question. So the first step is to answer that question. What are your passions or your interests? If passions is too bold of a word right now. How do you see those things differently or do those things differently than other people? That's always a really good step in finding the slight differences in how you operate than other people. And that's not saying that you are the only one in the world that thinks like that or does that or whatever. It's just that it's a little bit different than the people in your circle. And when you can connect to that difference, then you start to realize where your gold is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, the third question is, how can you craft your life and offerings around those passions? How can you make your craft really centered into your passion? And when we do that, when we center our offering, our art, our craft, our business into those passions, then we create a really self-sustaining business model that we will also talk about in a minute. So the next stage is shame. Once we've talked about honesty, we get clear on our passions, and we answer those questions, the next thing that we have to really think about is shame. There's a reason why we're not honest with ourselves, and it's because it brings up ideas of shame within us. And so shame is that we are taught to feel shame for being different. Whatever that difference is in how you do things, how you see things, that is your gold, but it is also your shame. And it's the differences that make us stand out and that make us fearful of standing out. Like for me, all my life, I was told that I have a big nose. And I was always really ashamed of that. And I would try to hide it whenever I could, and I would never turn profile, which I'm happy to do now because I'm totally over it. And sometimes there are obvious things like that you get made fun of, when you're a kid. And other times it's really a lot more subtle than that. And so one of my more subtle areas of shame is thinking that I'm stupid. I always thought that, and I always said that over and over and over to people. And I'll tell you a story about that in a second. So how do we outline our shame? Well, first, we ask ourselves, what narratives have you always told yourself that aren't true or that aren't healthy for yourself? And what narratives have you told other people about yourself that are not true or healthy? And so my story about this is that I would always tell people that I'm dumb, because I thought if I told them first, then they wouldn't think it about me secretly, and that would feel better, which is why we make fun of ourselves, right? We carry around this shame that gets embedded into our lives, and we begin telling that as a narrative to other people. So I was up on a stage once speaking for Sony, and I did something silly on stage, like I tripped over a cord or something, and I said to the audience, "Oh, I'm so stupid." And I kept going, and I gave my speech, and it was fine. And I got off stage, and I will never forget my friend Katrine Eisman. She is a Sony artisan of imagery. She is a force to be reckoned with. She came up to me, and she said, "Don't you ever, ever tell people that you're stupid again. You don't do that. You tell people what you want them to think about you." And I remember this sense of shame wash over me because I did it, and then I let it go. And I said, I will never, ever speak about myself in that way again. And I have never spoken about myself in that way again. Now I tell people all the ways that I'm intelligent, that I run a successful business, that I make great art, and I am not ashamed of that anymore because I let go of that narrative. And that's what we all have to do, is we have to let go of that shame narrative that we tell ourselves over and over and that we tell other people, so that we can make room for the honest conversation that needs to push our business and our art and ourselves forward. So the next thing is grief, because once you go through those steps of honesty and shame, you have to let go. You have to let go of that shame. You have to let go of that past self that you've carried with you for such a long time. And how do you do that? You recognize that it doesn't serve you anymore, that you need to make space for what does serve you. And then finally, once you've grieved that thing, you learn to trust. And it's a practice. Learning to trust that new self that you haven't been with very long, that is a practice. And once we can learn that our opinions and our place in the world are valid and interesting, then we can move on. So through these 4 pillars of honesty, shame, grief, and trust, we go through these stages and we begin to understand that we have something to offer, and that our personal values and the way that we see the world, that's important. Some questions you can ask are, what narrative have you told yourself or about yourself that doesn't serve you? What are some ways that you see the world around you differently from other people? What values are most important for you to uphold? What message do you feel needs to be spread? What message do you feel best equipped to spread? And these are just some questions to get you started in how you can start to answer these questions of honesty, shame, grief, and trust, and to work through them. And if you feel like you already have done this, think again. It is a cycle. This is a cycle that we go through again and again and again. And it's important that we check ourselves and we learn what new stories have we been telling about ourselves that are not true. This often comes up in the work that we create. We have to think about not only, what stories in ourselves do we need to change and push forward, but what stories are we going to tell the world? And how do you start to quantify and categorize those stories so that it relates to your brands and you can do that intentionally? Well, in my opinion, like I mentioned, you think about storytelling components and how is a story made? And you might think this relates more easily to books, novels, or even TV shows or movies, but it relates equally to art. So let me explain, okay? There are these 5 categories of storytelling that are pretty typical. Like if you learn about writing, for example, you'll probably learn about these things. There's the introduction, backstory, inciting incident, conflict, and resolution. The introduction is very simple. It's how we're introduced to the world that we are going to be spending time in. It might be the establishing shot in a movie where you see a sweeping view of where we are. So you start to get a sense of the time period and the landscape and what's there and what's going on. The backstory is when you learn about characters. It's character driven. It's the point in a movie, let's just say movie because that's the most accessible. A point in a movie where you learn about who these characters are and what's important that you need to know going forward into this story. And then you have the inciting incident, which is the most confusing of the 5. It's the point of no return in a movie where someone has made a decision that sets the movie in one direction or another direction. And depending on what they choose, they're going to go in one way or another. The conflict is when they meet, the issues of the movie come to a head and they have to directly figure out how they're going to solve their problem, and then the resolution is how it ends. So then how is that even remotely relevant to photography? Well, it's very likely that most of your art falls in one of these 5 categories. Are you somebody who sets the scene for people? Maybe that looks like a landscape or something like that, just as an example. Are you someone who introduces a world to the viewer? Are you somebody who creates character-driven work, and is that really important? My work falls into inciting incident. It's the point of no return. It's that point where there are more questions than there are answers, and we're just trying to make a choice. And then there's conflict. Do you create out of conflict? Is that the point of what you do? A lot of documentary photographers might fall into this because they're creating from a point of conflict where they're showing a conflict, a direct conflict. Resolution. Are you showing a happy ending to something or a sad ending to something? Are you closing a chapter in a book with the work that you do? Think about that for yourself. And then more types of storytelling that might really, really help you. And you can look this up. There are lots of articles about it. There are lots and lots of kinds of storytelling types. Comedy, tragedy, underdog, explorer, overcoming adversity. Basically, just like think of your favorite movie or book. Like maybe think of 5 or 10 of them and ask yourself, what kind of story is it? Is it funny? Is it sad? Is it about an underdog? Is it about an adventure? Is it about, like what is it? What kind of a story is it? So once you think about the things that you have an interest in, you can start to categorize them. And then think about your own work. What kind of storytelling do you fit into? So like I said, mine is very much inciting incident. Something has happened to push me in a different direction. That's typically where my work comes from. But I also tell explorer stories. So I explore my curiosity, my sort of inner workings, and then I offer to take you with me. And that's how I categorize my way of storytelling. And it's really helpful because when you figure out what type of story you want to tell, you can figure out how to communicate that best. When you know, like if I know that I am an explorer storyteller, then I can relate everything I do to the journey, to the greater journey that I'm going on. And that helps keep my brand centralized and significant. So that's one way that I do that. This image is a great example of how I do that through my imagery. It's the point of no return. She's made a choice. She is falling off the ledge and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if she's going to fall or fly or stay right there or float or what's going to happen. And that is where you, the viewer, come in. You get to decide what is going to happen to this girl. Is she going to fall? Is she going to fly? Is she going to spring right back up? Is she going to stay there? What is going on? That is your job, and that is why I create in the inciting incident. Because I am not here to answer questions for you. I am here for you to answer questions for yourself. All of my images do this to some extent. It's this, even if it's really calm like this image, it's the point of no return. It's the point where she is out there in the water. She is with the ice, mimicking this bird in the sky, and there is a story unfolding here. Not a conflict, just a story. This image is all about curiosity, exploring your curiosity. It's the literal embodiment of my explorer personality and my inciting incident imagery. This one, obvious example of somebody literally going on a journey. They've set off on a journey. What kind of a journey is it? Well, hopefully the visuals help tell that story. The colors, the atmosphere, the composition, the lighting, all of these things enhance the story that we're telling because I'm aware of what type of story I'm telling. And same with this image. She's pulling a sky down, a blue sky over a gray sky. It gives you a sense of story. There is something happening, and you as the viewer need to figure out what that is by putting the clues together. Same with this image, point of no return. Butterflies are either exploding from her back or coming to land on her. It's up to you to decide which one it is. These are some of my newer images that I've created this year that do the same thing but in a much more abstract way. Your images do not have to be storytelling images in order to tell a story. There is no story happening here that is explicit. There's no location. I'm just standing in front of a wall. And the paint and the mixed media are all giving you a sense of something happening, something bloody or violent maybe. That's up to you to decide. And so these are my newer images that take this abstract quality and still consider storytelling. In this case, coming through a barrier or sinking into it. That's up to you to decide. So in my way of creating my storied brand, I ask questions to the viewer. I pose questions verbally, in text, and through my images, as you just saw, so that you answer questions that I have posed to you through my imagery. I share behind the scenes work, and that helps me to communicate the story that I'm trying to tell. I share personal anecdotes. That is one way that I continually go back to how I am going to communicate my storied brand to you. I share a lot about lessons that I've learned because I think that's always relevant, and I share my failures. So these are the 5 ways that I personally tell you the story of my brand, and I do it almost every single day on social media. Story is rarely linear. It's not something that just happens and here's the beginning and the middle and the end and then it stops. Your branded story doesn't have to be linear either. It's not like you're telling your life story to somebody and then it's done. It's an ebb and a flow and up and down, and you go on these journeys of hardship and success and failures, and you're brought low and you're brought high. And it doesn't really matter if it goes in a clear, linear way. What matters is that you understand the underlying story of what you're living. And if you can do that, then you can always communicate a story that makes sense to somebody in that moment. It all goes back to your legacy. And I do believe that the way to find your legacy is to ask yourself about honesty and shame and grief and trust. And when you start to understand what your legacy is by going through that process, well, then you can start to encapsulate that thing that you need to communicate before you die in one sentence and through everything that you do. So do this. Write down the one sentence that encapsulates what you want to leave behind when you die. If that were tomorrow, what would you want to leave behind? What would you want to be known for? What is the thing that you feel is most important that you give to the world? And then ask yourself, does your art inhabit that space? Is your art doing that thing that you feel must be done before you die? Because newsflash, that could happen any day. That could happen right now. And it might be too late. And that is why I'm so passionate about talking about the Storied Brand, because it's not about making money. It's not about having a successful business, though I hope that it leads to those things. It is about understanding that your business and your art and what you're putting out there, that is your opportunity to show the world who you are and why you matter and why they should care and how you can impact those people. It's a big deal. And I feel really passionate about it. So we have to ask, does our art inhabit that space of our legacy? And that brings me back to these two images that I wanted to show you in the beginning, this personality versus the art. How do you reconcile those two things? Well, my art portrays beauty and darkness and the constant search for depth. That's what my art does. And it's exhibited in images like this, somebody going into the unknown. It's a literal representation of what my art is meant to do for you. And then my personality shows joy in creating minimally and despite failure, and that's what I am all about with my personality. How do you reconcile those things? How do you reconcile this personality of this girl who jumps in swampy water and does weird things for art versus the weird art that ends up being produced? And for me, my brand is my personality and my art. It's my ethos and my product, as it is for every company. So don't think that you have to be all this perfect package. There's the product, and then there's the person behind the product. So combined, my brand makes art accessible and brings light into the darkness. That's what I do in my Storied Brand. The trick, though, is that you have to be captivated by your own story so that your audience feels excited. And they need to feel the excitement that you feel. So really what I'm saying is that through your own explorations, wherever you feel that excitement bubbling, and you know that if you can share it, other people will feel it too. This is a good example of that. I one day decided I wanted to pour paint all over me for a photo, and I couldn't find a good spot for some reason, so I just pulled over on the side of the highway to do it. And I poured paint all over me to create this image. And it looked ridiculous. I was breathing through a straw for a long time, trying to stay calm with all the paint on me. People pulled over on the side of the road. And what gives me the most joy in the whole world is knowing that I have been a story for somebody else. That somebody's going to go home and sit at their dinner table and say, today I saw a girl covered in paint on the side of the highway. And that was me. And I did that for somebody. And that brings joy. And I find joy in it. And so I share all these weird, crazy things that I do for my art because I know that it will inspire other people to live a life of more joy. Now, enthusiasm comes in all forms. I happen to be really excited a lot of the time, but your enthusiasm might be quiet or it might be loud. It might be driven by curiosity or determination, but whatever that is, the best artists and the best businesses are curious. They are curious to dig deeper, to find that thing that they need to say, the story that has to be let out, and then they let people in on that curiosity. How do we make people care? You make people care by caring yourself. If you care, other people will care. I have been told this so many times that people don't even follow me for my art as much as they do because of my passion. Make people care by crafting your content to always relate back to that story. That's how we create a brand. We know what our story is, and we make sure that our products, our offerings, our content always relates back to that story or those stories. We make people care by having an opinion. Like I said, you're never going to please everybody. Not everyone in the whole world will be your client or the right person to look at your art. But if you can find the right people, then you'll start to notice that the more you voice your opinion, the more you're going to narrow down those people, and the more they will relate to you and admire you for doing that. You make people care by being consistent. Even if your story changes, still be consistent about the way you're communicating about that story. And then make people care by pushing your story forward. Don't stay stuck or stagnant in your story. Push it. Make it go somewhere. You have that power because you are interesting and valuable, and you can do that. The problem, though, is that so many people say, but what if my story isn't very interesting? Well, you know what? That's a choice that we make. That is a choice. There are people who have been through incredible things, tragic things, but the way that they tell their story isn't very interesting. We might think, oh, I wish that I had done that or been through that so that I would have this amazing story to tell. But the thing that you go through in your life does not necessarily make for an interesting story. It's the way that you see your life and the way that you communicate it that makes for an interesting story. I had to learn that the hard way. I used to, and this might sound weird or, be looked down upon, but I used to wish that I had gone through something like big, epic, tragic or something so that I would have some obvious story to tell and I could let people into my life that way, until I realized that tragedy and adventure and, beautiful, big, happy things that happen to us, they're only what you make them. And the same goes for those quiet moments that you might think nobody else cares about. But it's all about perspective. And if you let people into your curiosity, they will be curious about you and your story as well. Always find new anecdotes to relate back to your central theme and story. The more that we can find new ways of telling our story and new ways of experiencing our story, the more we can invite people in to come on that journey with us. So these are some ways that my story has evolved over the years, because it has. I've been doing this for over a decade. My story has evolved. So when I started photography, I was really invested in the exploration of death and grief, and I used it through this series called Small Deaths, where I took pictures of myself literally dead. Well, not literally, I mean looking actually dead in different places. And death was very literal for me then. I didn't have much more depth to it. I just wanted to do it, just see what that would be like. And then I moved into the exploration of what it means to be alive through fairy tales and dark fairy tales. And now I'm back to exploring death rituals and grief and the search to make beauty and darkness even deeper. And that's been my exploration so far. This is one of my earliest images, literally exploring death, somewhere in the middle starting to get into fairy tales and how we can explore that side of things. And now I'm back to pretty grotesque explorations of death, but in a deeper way than I ever have. My exploration of identity has been a big part of what I've done in the past decade, and it started with just like self-portraiture, where I didn't think much about what I was doing. I just did it. I just wanted to do it. And then self-portraiture began to shape my personality, and the adventures I was having were epic and amazing to me, and I wanted to share that, and that changed who I was fundamentally as a person. And then that evolved into deep self-analysis of my personal life. I began my art with self-portraits, but I had to change that at some point. I went on a journey of how I created. I moved on to expansive locations and models, and now I shoot only myself because I'm back to recognizing where I'm happiest. And I've even started mixed media lately. So these are some images of that sort of growth process, shooting self-portraits and trying to incorporate more of my personal life into that, and now mixed media. So your story is going to evolve, and that's okay, and that's good, and you just have to be intentional about those shifts. Let people into those moments of anxiety or joy. Let people into the places that need some elbow grease, where things aren't moving quite right because you're in a period of transition. That's okay. Everybody is, all the time. There is a myth of like this stable, successful, joyful person, and I don't believe in it. I think that we are all constantly working on ourselves and progressing and doing new things, and it's uncomfortable and it's weird and it's happy and it's sad, and it's okay to explore those things. There's this amazing TED Talk by this guy, this filmmaker, Andrew Stanton, that I love. It's my favorite TED Talk, and he talks about how all storytelling is joke telling because it's about knowing your punchline. It's about understanding that point of connection between you and your audience. And if we can understand that point of connection as our curiosity and the thing that ignites our passion, then we can ignite the passion of the people who are viewing our art. There is nothing more important. And that is why I am so passionate about the Storied Brand and about everybody embracing whatever it is that makes you completely you and unique and totally weird. So thank you for watching this presentation. I'm really, really grateful that you were here. I can't wait to answer your questions about this. If you want to follow me online, here are some ways that you can do that on Instagram and Facebook. I'm always just an email away. And thank you so much, Sony, for doing this. I really appreciate it. So grateful. Can't wait to answer your questions. Bye, guys.